Aloha, Reject Nation. I'm Greg Alba.
I'm John Humphrey.
We're going to watch a video from Screen Rant. Marvel's original MCU plan would have made Avengers Endgame very different. I'm curious to know what they have to say. Before we do that, I want to say thank you to everyone who has downloaded and followed us on the Stardust app. Over there, we do 30-second reaction reviews for films, TV shows, and or trailers. Sometimes they're micro sketches. We post daily. It's free to download, free to use, like Costco samples, except more beneficial. Do it today. Marvel! 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 Marvel!
MCU's Avengers are now, of course, some of the most iconic characters in movie history, but they could have been very different. The way in which their story's been told in the franchise points to a meticulously planned long-term idea, but that's actually far from being true. In fact, if truth be told, the MCU and its flagship team of heroes are a prime example of how last-minute changes, unforeseen obstacles, improvisation, off-the-cuff decisions, and freewheeling can actually emphatically work out for the best. In this video, we'll outline exactly what we mean.
You mean they didn't have 22 scripts ready?
Which would have given us very different Avengers. The entire lead up to the Avengers we now have in the MCU, and indeed the stories they've been involved in, have all stemmed from changes to the original plan. Even that now iconic Avengers mid-credits tease of Thanos was a last-minute decision by director Joss Whedon, who had no idea where it would eventually lead, because he wanted Loki to have a master.
That went over my head and didn't know that.
Stones wasn't made concrete until years later, and that resulted in a number of random pieces of the MCU jigsaw having to be retconned. For example, the Tesseract wasn't originally meant to be the Space Stone, but even before that, Marvel Studios had played a game of trial and error with regards to the way their Avengers initiative would unfold on screen. Of course, the ultimate plan for Phase 1 of the MCU was always to bring the Avengers together, but the first Avengers movie had an initial release date set for 2011 before it was pushed back a year. Moreover, what Earth's Mightiest Heroes could have looked like was almost very different, both in terms of the team's lineup and the actors who'd be portraying them. The first real tease of the plan to form an Avengers team in the MCU was, of course, in that famous post-credit scene from 2008's Iron Man, when Samuel Jackson's Nick Fury turned up at Tony Stark's Malibu mansion to talk about the idea. But the movie itself was deceptively standalone, with only a running gag about S.H.I.E.L.D's long-winded full name being the only real hint at a wider universe. But that post-credits tease really was nothing more than that. A tease. And believe it or not, just like the mid-credits scene of the Avengers in which Thanos debuted 4 years later, it was actually something of a last-minute decision to include. And there weren't any concrete plans to expand upon it. But anyone who thought the scene was nothing more than a cheap nod to the comics was quickly proven wrong. Because a mere couple of months later, in the Incredible Hulk's pre-credits tease, Tony Stark approached William Hurt's General Ross about the team he was putting together. The outline of the early ideas for the team could clearly be seen by this point. Tony Stark was brought in to lead the team, possibly to track down the AWOL Hulk in what would have been a very similar story to the Avengers #1 comic book from 1963. That first issue saw Loki attempting to escape exile by manipulating the Green Goliath into accidentally destroying a bridge. What was teased Avengers-wise in the early days of the MCU was actually very different to what we eventually got. Stark was deemed unsuitable for the team until S.H.I.E.L.D. had no other choice but to bring him in, while the Hulk was a completely different character by 2012 in more ways than one. Not only was the early Avengers blueprint hurtling towards a different story, there were also different actors in some of the key roles. Mark Ruffalo became Bruce Banner and Hulk after Edward Norton famously had a difference of creative opinion with Marvel Studios, which in turn served as a way of conveniently distancing the MCU from the Incredible Hulk movie, which Marvel Studios seemed intent on doing. Due to a pay dispute with the studio, Terrence Howard was replaced as James War Machine Rhodes by Don Cheadle from 2010's Iron Man 2 onward. Scarlett Johansson has played Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow, since Iron Man 2, but it was Emily Blunt who was originally set to star as the character. Jon Favreau, who directed the first 2 Iron Man movies and famously plays Happy Hogan in the MCU, had her down as his first choice. But she had to quit before she even got started when Fox exercised a contract clause from the Devil Wears Prada to have her star in Gulliver's Travels, which must be an absolute bummer for her when she looks at what a phenomenon the MCU's become. While none of these changes had the level of impact that changes to personnel behind the cameras had, they did play something of a part in reshaping how the MCU could have developed. Iron Man 2 is the movie that marked the point at which the MCU's original Phase 1 plan notably veered off track. Tony Stark's arc changed course dramatically, as Natasha Romanoff assessed his suitability for the Avengers, and ultimately came to the conclusion that he wasn't fit for purpose. It seemingly created something of a plot hole by contradicting the credit scenes in both of the previous movies in the MCU, Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk. But the plot hole was suitably filled by the Marvel one-shot short movie The Consultant in 2011, which explained that Stark approaching Ross was actually a ploy by S.H.I.E.L.D. to trick the General into keeping Abomination locked up. In fact, post-movie retcons like these were quite commonplace until the early days of Phase 2 of the franchise. When Thor was released in 2011, key aspects of the Avengers that were consistent with the team we ended up with were starting to be introduced. But that didn't mean there wasn't still some confusion. The post-credits scene had Eric Selvig chatting with Nick Fury deep within Project Pegasus about working on the Tesseract, when the presumed dead Loki appeared in a reflection, controlling Stellan Skarsgård's character. While Tom Hiddleston's character did go on to mind control Selvig, and while the Tesseract was a key part of the first Avengers offering, the fact that the God of Mischief was already on Earth completely contradicted the manner of his introduction in the team-up movie. Captain America the First Avenger, however, which was released just a couple of months after Thor in the same year, was all rather cohesive with the rest of the expanding MCU. The somewhat convoluted changes that were made to the franchise, however, such as Tony Stark was recruited in the first act of the Avengers despite being turned down by the team in his previous MCU appearance, were due to changes that occurred behind the scenes. X2 and X-Men Last Stand writer Zach Penn had been working on a script for the Avengers since 2006, but he'd been forced to make constant adjustments as directors enacted influence and characters began to fully form. As a result, alterations were made to both characters and the story, especially with regards to Tony Stark. Penn's first draft was submitted to Marvel Studios in early 2010, but everything changed when the Avengers found its director. Joss Whedon was extremely dismissive of Penn's work, saying there was a script, there just wasn't a script I was going to film a word of. It's not known exactly what Penn's script entailed, but it's believed it involved the Red Skull, and Whedon's alterations made what he did with Justice League look minor in comparison. The fundamentals of Whedon's amended script were simple. The titular team of superheroes would go up against Tom Hiddleston's Loki, fighting amongst themselves along the way, and it would culminate in an epic battle against the God of Mischief and his army at the end. It's probably fair to assume that the brief Whedon was given to work with was similar to that of Penn's. The final Avengers movie wasn't too dissimilar to the aforementioned comic The Avengers #1 after all. And while the narrative drive was different, the script had very similar DNA to the one he'd previously dismissed. But the main problem Whedon had with the initial script wasn't the story, it was its character and spark. He believed Penn's vision lacked chemistry as far as the relationships between the titular heroes were concerned. There was a time, for example, when the poorly written terms in Scarlett Johansson's Iron Man 2 contract meant she might not return for the movie, so one version of the script had a key role for the Wasp written into it. The Wasp is, of course, a founding member of the Avengers in the comics, and she would have provided the team with a feminine touch in Black Widow's absence. That obviously never happened, but the impact on the MCU as a whole would have been huge if it did. Black Widow's absence would have needed explaining. Janitor Hope Van Dyne would have been introduced to the franchise 3 years ahead of Ant-Man, and it would have completely altered the story of that Ant-Man movie, which at that point was still going to be helmed by Edgar Wright. There was another draft that saw Loki teaming up with Ezekiel Stane, the son of Jeff Bridges' Obadiah Stane from Iron Man, due to Whedon's concerns about whether or not Tom Hiddleston could carry the villainous mantle alone, and the fact he wasn't convinced by the idea of placing so much attention on Thor. The problem is, this would have run the risk of making it feel more like Iron Man 2.5 than an Avengers movie. Captain America's role in the movie was also adjusted, albeit in minor fashion, quite late in the day. The movie saw him becoming the team's undisputed leader, but several scenes were cut from the start of the movie that would have emphasized him more as a man out of time. It was probably due to the fact that the first Avenger hadn't brought in a particularly impressive sum at the box office, so being more careful with the character was deemed the safe option until he was really in the thick of the Avengers action. Of course, different actors would have resulted in different stories too. Had Terrence Howard reappeared, War Machine would have had a major role in the Avengers, given the fact that his initial Iron Man deal had him as the star. Edward Norton might have strived for more creative control and given the Hulk a bigger role, but his chemistry with the other actors probably wouldn't have been as good as Mark Ruffalo's, which would have limited what could have been done regarding Hulk and Bruce Banner-driven character stories. A major influence of Whedon's script changes, however, were on the actual tone of the MCU. That Whedon-esque humor has now become known as MCU humor, and any brief attempts to diverge from it in the franchise, such as with Shane Black at the helm of Iron Man 3, weren't really received very well. James Gunn has since exemplified that MCU humor notion with a very similar quirky sense of fun in his Guardians of the Galaxy movies. The Infinity Gauntlet comic book arc is certainly a story that was always a potentially prime source for inspiration in the franchise, but it didn't become the planned endgame, no pun intended, until the first Avengers movie, and the unplanned decision to include the Prune-Chin despot in the mid-credits scene. The retcons required to bed him into the Infinity Saga after that make the road to the Avengers look meticulously planned over a long period, but it certainly wasn't. Iron Man was a fantastic platform to build on for the MCU, and when the time came to assemble the Avengers, the franchise was popular enough that the unprecedented idea had a great chance of working, but that popularity certainly didn't stem from an orchestrated master plan. Marvel Studios went into a lot of their ventures completely blind, and in spite of all of the time, talent, and hard work that's gone into it, the inconsistencies are still clear to see if you look hard enough. What do you think of this video? Would the MCU have been better or worse if the original plans for the Avengers had been
Endgame makes it look like it's perfect. Endgame makes it look like, damn, they had this mapped out from the beginning. That's crazy. It's like Endgame really makes the whole plan feel like it's all building to this full circle, even back to the first Iron Man.
In a way, I mean, the point they're making here about, using different directors, little creative flourishes that kind of change the shape of the story. I feel like Endgame, in a way, exemplifies that even more in the way that it goes back and touches on previous movies that needed tying up or that needed acknowledgement for certain things. They've proven themselves very conscientious with how they've handled this series.
What this video really remind me of, the powerful influence Joss Whedon has played over the entire MCU. And it's kind of sad how much Joss Whedon has pretty much distanced himself from Marvel ever since all the
Age of Ultron
all the Age of Ultron crap that went down.
Which is crazy too, because not only is his humor and his sensibility really apparent in the MCU, but it's also through the success of the MCU impacted so many other movies now.
The Joss Whedon humor has essentially become the Marvel brand humor, because that really became defined with Avengers Assemble. And I remember Phase 1 being kind of rocky when people would make digs at like what's been going on with Star Wars and how it's had some missteps, or even the DC universe. I'm like, Marvel wasn't perfect at first. They had the benefit that the first Iron Man was fucking amazing. Incredible Hulk is rather forgettable now. Iron Man 2, Captain America was underwhelming for a lot of people. Thor
even
was
has
like
some mixed reactions.
Yeah, it was like, Thor's better than I thought it would be.
Yeah, it seems like Iron Man is the great one, and then everything from Phase 1 up until Avengers is like pretty good, maybe okay.
And I did learn some interesting stuff here. I mean, with the Iron Man 1 post-credit scene, how they put it was that it was sort of a last-minute addition that they wanted to throw on there.
And they didn't have big plans to expand it.
They had a Hulk coming out later. I imagine they probably shot that like, you might as well just throw it on there.
Have fun with this.
And then it seems like since the post-credit thing seemed to really take off and create all this hype and anticipation, that it drastically reshaped Iron Man 2, which was met with a lot of criticism. Okay, now they're doing the whole setup for the Avengers way too much in my face now, as opposed to little trinklets here or there, and then a post-credit scene. Now it seemed like Marvel's heads were like, oh damn, we really got something here with this Avengers tease. Let's really capitalize on it.
Well, and that's the funny thing to me about looking back over the MCU, because there are certain things that are really surprising to know weren't pre-planned, but overall, the more I think about just the journey we've all been on, Phase 1 especially does feel like a studio figuring out what their plan is, and have that first mega success with Iron Man, but then it takes kind of till the Avengers to really repeat that. I find it fascinating the way you can kind of track that, because there feels like a certain point in the MCU, and I'm not sure really what film to put it on other than maybe the Avengers, where they do sort of find what I feel like is their longer term plan. For a lot of it, I appreciate that it is kind of a living little universe that can be affected by different people, and that will cause it to change over time.
Well, I think it's important that they don't map out too far in advance. I feel like what they got is a guideline, but it's not a holy Bible that they got to live by in order to make sure that it goes as very specific way each and every time. Like, it doesn't surprise me that they've had to improvise constantly or readjust or reevaluate their strategy. It just makes sense of why it works so well.
That's smart,
The entire MCU overall,
Very adaptive.
I think the thing that took me for a loop the most, somehow I completely missed that information that Thanos was just a fun little sting that Whedon threw out there, but they really didn't have plans, but it led to the culmination of the MCU. It led to it.
Oh yeah,
Which is it's just so funny to me. I'm like, oh damn, I could have sworn that was like their master plan from the get-go.
Yeah, well, and going back to what you said earlier about the bummer of the fact that Joss Whedon has distanced himself so much, it's like now, ever since that little post-credit sting, so much of the arc of the whole saga has stemmed from this one little random idea he threw into this movie. Little tenuous things like that are fascinating to me because it could have just as easily not happened.
Because I know that wasn't Josh Brolin. I know that it's not Josh Brolin at the end of Avengers Assemble. Same time, it's like, wow, the influence Joss Whedon has had, but now his name isn't even really associated. It's like you hear Joss Whedon, you think of Marvel. But when you think of Marvel, you don't think of Joss Whedon.
No.
You know?
No, you think of the Russos.
Yeah, with the Avengers, you think of the Russos. The Russos wouldn't have had Infinity War and Endgame if it wasn't for what Joss Whedon did. He became the guy who's helped shape it, but then the guy who's also given us the worst Avengers movie. You're only as good as your last thing you did, and the last thing he did for Marvel was Age of Ultron. It just seems like that's the stamp that everyone remembers him by. This video really brought to light, like, damn, it'd be kind of cool if you brought Whedon back for like one more random thing. If he was able to come back with good graces with these guys.
There was an agreeable scenario.
It'd be fun, man. And there's some other fun things were in here, like Emily Blunt going to be Black Widow. That would have been a great casting. I think Scarlett Johansson has really made her stamp on the character. I think Emily Blunt would have worked just as well.
Yeah, and she would have brought a whole different, acting sensibility to it,
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, Emily Blunt is one of my favorite actors in general working today, and she's proven her diversity, and she's proven she can do action with things like everyone references Edge of Tomorrow or even Sicario. You kind of combine both, you can get a Black Widow character. So Emily Blunt would have been a fantastic pick. I'm satisfied with the Black Widow trade. I heard they're filming the Black Widow movie. I think I saw set photos.
Yeah, and actually Emily Blunt is gonna be Scarlett Johansson's stunt double. Yeah.
They were talking about how Endgame would have been totally different, but it doesn't seem like they had Endgame in mind.
Yeah, there wouldn't have been an Endgame. It would have been something else.
This is more surrounding Avengers Assemble, if anything, and how Avengers Assemble affected the trajectory of what the MCU would culminate into. Yeah. But like having the Wasp as an early addition and introducing before Ant-Man, that would have changed the MCU. That would have also changed Ant-Man in total, because she doesn't even become the Wasp in the first Ant-Man movie.
No, not at all. Well, yeah, and then I'm thinking, like, if they had the Wasp as part of the team, would we have met Scott Lang in that movie as some kind of weird Easter egg supporting character for later?
Would it have been Evangeline Lilly?
Yeah, it would have been someone different.
It would have been, like, the Wasp character would have been totally different. And as part of being an Avengers character, she still hasn't made her stamp as part of the team yet. Like, she participates at the end fight of Endgame, but she's not, known as one of the faces of the Avengers. She's one of the Marvel faces, but she's not one of the faces of the Avengers. At least to the the public sphere. I know there's technicality and semantics and yada yada yada, but you know what I'm getting at.
For somebody out there, she is the face.
I didn't know Zach Penn was also the guy who penned the first draft for years.
Penned, because his name is Penn.
Poor guy.
I know.
He worked fucking years on that shit. And if that quote from Joss Whedon is true, I'm like, man, that's mean.
I'm not filming a single word of this shit.
Oh, there was a script, but I ain't filming that shit.
I'm keeping it in my bathroom now so I can save on toilet paper.
God. It's so cruel.
Aw, I mean, yeah, maybe you didn't have that in mind, but dude.
Like, Zach Penn they were saying he had to work off of the constant rewrites and the influences and input of what the other directors were doing with their films over time.
Yeah, I can't help but imagine he was like, hey man, come on, they just told you to do your thing. I had to adjust to everybody.
You came in here way late, man. I've been working on this thing since the beginning. Like,
I keep getting notes, like every time a movie comes out, I gotta change the whole thing.
I don't know if that's what he actually said.
If it's just somebody's summary of a sentiment or something.
Yeah, either way, that's still a bummer for the guy, because no one associates Avengers Assemble with Zach Penn.
This is true. They don't.
It's such a bummer. It's part of Hollywood. you
Making
know?
money, it seems like. He writes.
Yeah, I mean, worked on the X-Men films and stuff. Well, this was a fascinating video. This was really, really interesting.
Expert class in yes-anding. On
Absolutely.
a global scale.
Oh, yeah. All right, guys. Well, go subscribe to Screen Rant if you haven't done so already. Check out more of their videos, especially Ryan and George's Pitch Meetings, one of my favorite segments on YouTube to have ever existed. You can subscribe to The Real Rejects. Please click that notification bell. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, implying positivity. And before we wrap this video up, I want to give a Patron of the Day shout out to a lovely woman named Adelia Chamberlain. I mentioned this in a video recently that wasn't Avengers related, so I feel like it's best to mention it again. She wrote this wonderful article about the psychology of the characters in Avengers Endgame, how pretty much that whole arc is all of them portraying different elements of grief, and it's beautifully done, and it's certainly affected my third time watching Avengers Endgame, and I was really seeing a lot of what she had brought to my attention. So I would highly recommend you guys go check out that article. There's a link in the description box. And on a side note, she's reading, I think she's read all the Game of Thrones books, and she's just about to start Game of Thrones.
Oh, get ready for that journey.
Get ready for a satisfying conclusion on your end, my dear.
Yeah. All those years of reading are about to be justified.
Oh, yeah. See you guys.